here I am today. Guess what? I am not wildly rich. I am not wildly successful in business. None of those things that I was pursuing came to pass. But instead, here I am with you, which doesn't seem all that bad. Thank you for validating that decision, because I'm still not sure about it.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
So today I'm beginning a brand new series. It's called That Old Time Religion. And we're going to have a little fun with this. And so let me start by saying this. How many of you notice that our culture today has a love affair with new stuff? We just love new stuff. People want to live in a new house with new appliances and new furniture, and they want to watch a new TV, and they want to drive a new car, and everything has to be new. Nobody wants anything old. Have you noticed that? You just try to get rid of your old TV or your old cell phone or your old couch. Nobody wants it. You go to Salvation Army, they won't even take your old TV. You know that's true. You can't sell it. You can't give it away. Nobody wants it. You take it to Salvation Army, they go, step away from the entrance. We don't want that old piece of junk. And we have become part of a disposable culture. And we just throw everything out. Nobody has any value for old things. You know, a number of years ago, I was in England, and I went to this town, stayed in this town, where the average house, you ready for this, was 450 years old. And the house we were in was 500 years old. And I looked at this house, I thought, it's square, it's straight, it's as solid as a rock. You know why it was as solid as a rock? It was made out of rock. That's why. Here's a picture of it. Look at this house. 500 years old, looks pretty good. Straight, it was beautiful. I thought, this is curious, and there was this little plaque on the side of the man who built it years ago. I went and looked at it. What was that guy's name? Fred Flintstone. Yeah, and the guy who built the one next door was Barney Rubble. I mean, honestly, his house almost looked like that. But anyway, you know, you see these sort of things in Europe. We don't see them here. And here's where I'm going with all this. What I'm trying to do is trying to instill in you an appreciation for things that are sometimes old. And there's one thing that's old that'll never change and will never wear out. It's called the gospel. And it's that old-time gospel, which is actually at this time is quite ancient. And you know, I'm not talking about, you know, this dead, uninspiring, irrelevant, impersonal gospel that some of you remember growing up. I am talking about the timeless, powerful, glorious gospel of Jesus Christ that has the power to change and transform any human being. It's the only thing that really works in our life. And guess what? It's over 2,000 years old. And see, that's what I'm talking about, going back to this day. And yet, when we look at the gospel today, I don't know. When I look at what we've done with the gospel, we have watered it down, we have changed it, we've made it more palatable and easier for people to digest, and we've taken the value out of it. I look south of the border, and they've taken the gospel and they've mixed it with the Republican Party, the American dream, and it comes out looking like an Amway meeting. I looked north of the border here in Canada, and we have the social gospel, and what we've done with that is it looks like the Kiwanis Club or a self-help community group. This isn't the gospel. It's like, reminds me of this story of this guy who goes into a bookstore and he says to the clerk, "Can you point me to the self-help section?" She says, "Well, I could, but that would kind of defeat the purpose now, wouldn't it?" And when we look at the gospel, we need to realize that this old gospel, this old-time gospel has the power to change our lives. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one little verse today. It's out of Jeremiah chapter 6. We're going to look at this in the NIV, and it's verse 16. And this is what it says. This is what the Lord says. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. But you said, we will not walk in it. So what I'm going to do in this series is I'm going to take our three aspects of our vision, which is to help people to know God, live free, find purpose. And each week I'm going to strike out on one of those things. Well, strike out in the right sense, not the wrong sense. And this week is called Ancient Paths. And what I'm going to talk about today is how we would know God and find that ancient path. And he tells us this, to stand at the crossroads. So let me give you a little history, a little context for this story. So Jeremiah lived in the day just before Nebuchadnezzar attacked and invaded Israel and sacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, took people captive. But before that happened, he was the prophet, and he was warning the people, because this is what had happened. The people had turned their backs on God. They had rejected God's laws. They were no longer keeping the Sabbath day. They were no longer keeping the Sabbath year. They were following after false gods. Not unlike today when you think about it. And God sends them the weeping prophet Jeremiah, and he comes to warn them. And what did he get for his efforts? Do you remember? It says, we will not walk. They said, we will not walk in this way. And they would not listen to Jeremiah. And they took him, they lowered him down into an abandoned well, and he sank neck deep in the muck. And he left them there for days till he almost died. They would not listen to him. And see, one of the things God does is he never brings judgment on people without first offering them mercy and grace. He always gives people a second chance. And that's what he did with the people of Israel. They didn't have to go through this judgment. They didn't have to get sacked by Nebuchadnezzar, but they would not accept the grace that God extended to them. And even today, when you look at it, God's not bringing judgment anytime soon on his people. That's why the book of Revelation, the book of judgment, it's at the end. And so far, we've had 2,000 years of the dispensation of grace, 2,000 years of God extending mercy and grace to people. But here's the thing. If you will not accept his grace, you will have to face his judgment. But you know what we can do? We can ask ourselves this question: what path am I going to go down? What road am I going to go down? And that's why Jeremiah says this. He says, stand at the crossroads and look. So I'm going to give you three things. Here they are, and they're right from this passage, but I'm going to simplify them even further. Number one is to stop and look. Number two is to ask for directions. Number three is to take the ancient path. See, if he says stop at the crossroads and look, you know what that means? That means you actually have to stop. And what we do in life is we don't stop. We barrel along in life, and we rarely stop and look. And I think everybody, one of us, understands this metaphor. The metaphor is you come to a crossroads. You've all been there, right? You're in a new area. You're in a new community. You're driving along in your car. You come to a street. You don't know whether to turn left or right. What do? You stop, and then what? Look, and you may or may not think, but that would be the next step. And you stop and you look, and you have to decide, am I turning right or am I turning left? And so this is what Jeremiah says. He says, you know what you need to do in life? You need to stop, and you need to look, and you need to determine whether you're going to turn right or left. And here's what oftentimes we do. We just go with the flow. We just go with the traffic, and if the traffic's all going that way, we go that way. Let me tell you a little story about this. So a number of years ago, Kathy and I were traveling to the city of Dallas, Texas. It was the first time I've ever been in the city. And if you've ever been on the freeway system in Dallas, it's unbelievable. I want to show you the picture of the freeway we came up on doing 75 miles an hour. Here's the freeway, picture of it. There it is. And that's a real freeway. And here's what you know if you've traveled in the freeway system. If you take the wrong ramp, what happens? You are lost for a half an hour or an hour till you get back. And so I wasn't prepared to do that. We were coming up to this intersection, and it was a fork in the road. There it was. It was splitting off like this. Didn't know whether to go left or right. Kathy had no GPS. It was before the days of that. Kathy's got the map. I'm driving. I said, Kathy, left or right? She said, I don't know. I said, left or right? I got 10 seconds to the side. Left or right? Left or right? She says, I don't know. And so I didn't take either left or right. I went right down the middle and came to a stop. Right in the V. And I just sat there and stopped, and there was cars whizzing by us at 75 miles an hour on both sides. And I'm just sitting there. I said, left or right? Left or right? We're now, what did we do? I mean, biblically, we did the right thing. We stopped and looked. Legally, maybe not, because we were not there. True story. We were not there for 30 seconds, and the flashers come up behind me, and it's the state trooper. I thought, really? I stop here, and really I'm getting pulled over for this? And so anyway, he walks up there with this broad brim hat. I roll down the window. He says, how you doing today, sir? I said, not very good. I'm trying to invoke some sympathy, right? And he says, what are you doing? I said, I'm lost. I didn't know whether to turn left or right. It's so confusing. To which he said, it is confusing. He says, I live here. It's confusing. You should have gone right. Because I told him where I was going. And I was so grateful because he didn't give us a ticket. He told us where to go, told us to go right. I thought, I love you, sir. And it's funny how somebody does something nice for you, you fall in love with them. But anyway, that's a little bit of picture of life. We're all barreling along. Don't miss this. You get caught up in that freeway traffic, you just go with the flow. Am I right? You just go with the flow. And sometimes you can't turn off. And it's a picture of life. It's a metaphor of life. Sometimes we're barreling through life, and we don't realize that we need to stop and look. So this summer, we ran into a friend of ours. She's a young friend. We've known her since she was a little girl. And she grew up without a mother in her home, and so that'll explain some of this story. And so Kathy said to her, so how are you doing? What are you up to? She says, well, I've been living with my boyfriend for 5 years. You notice how people aren't even embarrassed about saying that anymore? They just say it like, it's sort of normal. And she says, I've been living with my boyfriend for 5 years. She's only 22 years old. And so Kathy says to her, so is this the guy you want to spend the rest of your life with? You know what she said? She said, I don't know. He doesn't know either. And I think, well, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? See, this is what people do. They get caught up and they don't stop and look. And so Jeremiah says, stand at the crossroads. You know what the crossroads are? It's the fork in the road, right? You have to make this decision. Which direction are you going to go? You've all seen a fork in the road, have you? Well, let me show you. Here it is. There's a fork in the road. That's in Carlsbad, California. They actually have a fork in the road, which I think is really cool. As I look in Scripture, I see what happens is if people don't get confronted in their path, they'll often not stop. And a lot of times what they have to do is they have to hit bottom, or they have to hit the wall, or they have to have a collision of some sort. And I look at the prodigal son. He's a great example of this. As long as he had money, right? As long as he had daddy's inheritance, as long as he had that money and he was spending on wine, women, and fortune, he never gave any thought to his direction in life. Am I right? And it wasn't until he found himself waist deep in pig slop that the scripture says, and he came to his senses. And he finally stopped and looked at his life and looked where it had ended him up. And he said to himself, life was better with my father. In fact, my father's servants get treated better than I do. And he says, I will return to my father's house. And he chose the ancient path that led back to his father's house. Are you following this? But what did he have to do? Unfortunately, he had to hit bottom. And a lot of times, we're that knuckleheaded in life that we don't realize that we can make that decision before we hit bottom. Look at Saul of Tarsus. Saul of Tarsus, interesting character. When he was out killing Christians and persecuting the church, question for you, did he feel like he was doing anything wrong? No, he didn't have any sense of shame or guilt or compunction to go on killing Christians and persecuting the church. He felt what he was doing was the right and the good thing. And so he had no intention of stopping and looking at what direction, what path he was on in life. So God himself confronted him and stopped him on the road to Damascus. And he had a virtual crossroads experience. And he had to stop. He stopped him dead in his path. And in fact, he made him blind and eventually opened up his eyes so he could look and decide, what path do you want to go down? And he changed his direction. Am I right about that? I believe that every person, every single one of us, when we come to Christ or shortly thereafter, we have to redirect our path. If you stay on the same path you were on your whole life, after you come to Christ, there's probably something wrong. Because we are all on the wrong path to begin with. And we have to get on the right path. And God needs to stop. You need to stop and look and decide, what path am I going to be on? So let me tell you about my journey. I came to Christ when I was 23 years old. And after I came to Christ at 23 years old, nothing changed. I just kept on the path that I was on. And I had a very specific path in life. At 23, what I wanted to do was be extremely wealthy and extremely successful at business. And that was my vision, and that was my path. And after I came to Christ, I was going to be extremely successful Christian and extremely wealthy Christian. No, nothing really changed, except I was a Christian. So that's where I was going. And then this is what happened. So I got married at 23. I ended up without a job. I was massively in debt and didn't know what to do with my life next. But here's the one thing I never lost in that, was my sense of self-confidence. Now, I know that's probably a huge surprise to you, that as a young man, now I know I'm not like that today, but back then I just brimmed with confidence all the time. And so I thought, I'm out of work, I'm massively in debt, I'm newly married, I need a job, no biggie. I'll just go apply for a job, get a job as a president or vice president. I'm good with either, it doesn't matter. So there I was, I told you I was brimming with confidence. So there I am applying for these jobs and trying to get, in at the top, start at the top and work my way down. And so anyway, after several months, I haven't got any job offers, and I'm getting shut down. And I wouldn't say it completely obliterated my confidence, but it took the edge off it a little bit, just a little bit. And so there I was, again, unemployed, massively in debt, married, no job. And I had just applied for a job. They said no. I was driving down the street. I was a new Christian. I had some friends that had decided to go to Bible school. So I thought, you know what, I'll go to the Bible school, and I'll sit down with them, catch the last class or two, and then I'll go out for lunch with them, and at least I'll have something to do today. So I went and I sat down in Bible school, and there I was. Imagine this picture. I'm sitting down there, and I'm just listening to the man preaching, whoever was speaking that day. Don't remember what he was saying. But all of a sudden in that moment, I felt like the Lord said, so I finally got your attention. You finally stopped and shut up. And now I want you to listen. And he said, this is where I want you to be. And I'm sitting there thinking, this is where he wants me to be in Bible school? And as I listened to the messages of the two sessions that I was in, at the end of the morning at 12 noon when they dismissed, I went to the register and I signed up for Bible school. And when people say, Pastor Mark, when did you realize the call of God in your life and decide to go into ministry? I didn't decide to go into ministry. I got trapped. God tricked me. Wouldn't give me a job. Wouldn't let me pursue my vision in life. He made me stop and look and listen. And there I was. He trapped me in that place, and I signed up for Bible school. And then, of course, everything in my life changed from that moment. You realize that. Now I'm heading towards ministry. So here I am today. Guess what? I am not wildly rich. I am not wildly successful in business. None of those things that I was pursuing came to pass. But instead, here I am with you, which doesn't seem all that bad. Thank you for validating that decision, because I'm still not sure about it. So the first thing is this. You need to stand at the crossroads. You need to stop and look. The second thing is you need to ask for directions. So, have you ever thought about this? Did Moses and the children of Israel really need to wander in the wilderness for 40 years? No, they didn't have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, but Moses, being a guy, would not stop and ask for directions. And I know that's sort of a joke, which it is, but it's sort of true in a sense, because they did not have to wander. There was no reason they had to spend 40 years in the wilderness. Did they come to the crossroads? They did. They came to the crossroads where they got to that place, and they actually stopped at that place, and they actually looked. They sent in the spies. They sent 12 spies into the promised land. They came back with a report. 2 of them, Joshua, Caleb, they stood up. They said, let us go up at once, for we are well able to overcome it. That was the first report. Second report was the other 10. And they stood up and they said, we are not able to overcome it, for there are giants in the land, and they are bigger than us, and we are like grasshoppers in our own sight and also in theirs. And so what the people did, don't miss this, is they listened to the wrong advice. They could turn right and go into the promised land, or they could turn left and go back into the wilderness. What did they do? They took the bad advice and went back into the wilderness, where for 40 years they wandered, and every last one of them died in the wilderness. Turns out that was a bad choice, because they didn't listen to the instruction. See, here's what I've discovered. I have discovered very few of us will make the right choices in life without asking the right people for directions. Very few of us make the right choice. The right choice almost never happens by accident. What happens is we ask people, and people who know us, people who love us, people who have been down the road before us, those are the people you ask. Someone who's already been down that road. Joshua and Caleb had been there. They could have listened to that advice. See, when we got stuck on that freeway in Dallas, when the police officer told me to turn right, I turned right. Why? He'd been down that road. He knew where it went. It was good advice. I needed to ask him which way to turn, and he told me. And see, this is an important thing for us. Every one of us will reach that place in life where you will need the counsel of others, where without counsel a man's plans go awry, but in a multitude of counselors there is safety. Isn't that what happened to the Ethiopian eunuch? Do you remember this story? in the book of Acts, he's traveling along in his chariot reading the book of Isaiah. And Philip comes by and says, do you know what you're reading? Do you remember what he said? He said, how can I know and understand if someone doesn't explain it to me? And what we have is Philip explaining to him the meaning of the book of Isaiah, and it was pointing to Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior. And the Ethiopian eunuch says, what prevents me from being baptized? And they stopped, and he baptized the Ethiopian eunuch. And Christianity, for the very first time in history, went back to Ethiopia. It's an amazing story. All because a man, Philip, was ready to share and give a defense of why the hope was in him in Christ. And see, we never know what's going to happen. You never know what encounters you have in life. People you think, well, I don't know. I mean, what happened to the guy on the plane? I don't know. What will happen? You never know what's going to happen. See, let me tell you one little story about this. One of my favorites, actually. So the president of the Zimbabwe Bible Society was standing on a street corner in his town one day, and he was handing out Bibles, New Testaments. And this man walked by and he said, sir, would you like a New Testament? And the man said, no, I don't want it. And he says, I want you to take it anyway. I'd love you to have it. He says, if you give me that Bible, I will tear those pages out one by one, and I will use them for rolling papers, and I'll smoke them. And so this guy says, I'll tell you what, I'll give you this Bible, and you can smoke each page as long as you promise that you will read each page before you smoke it. And so the guy says, it's a deal. And he hands him a Bible, and that's the last time he saw him. 15 years later, this president of the Bible Society is at a preacher's conference, and there's hundreds and hundreds of people in this room, and there's this dynamic preacher standing up front, and he's preaching the gospel. And about halfway through his message, he decides he's going to stop, and he's going to tell his story, his testimony about how he came to Christ. He says, let me tell you how I came to Christ. He says, one day I was walking down the street, and a man offered me a Bible. And I told him, if you give me that Bible, I'm going to smoke every page. I'm going to use them as rolling paper. And he told me that if I took that Bible, and if I would read every page before I smoked it, he would give it to me. So I took that Bible. And he says, this is what happened to me. He said, I smoked Matthew and I smoked Mark. And I smoked Luke and I started to smoke John. But when I got to John 3:16, I couldn't smoke any longer because I discovered the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that he is my Lord and Savior, and he was in my heart. You never know what's going to happen when we share the gospel with someone. And so the first thing is this. The first thing is you need to stop and look. Second thing is you need to ask for directions or be ready to give those directions to people who ask you. And the last and final thing is this, is to choose the ancient path. You got to make that decision that you're going to walk down that path that's going to lead somewhere. And I want to show you what Jesus said about the ancient path, because he gave us some real insight on this, and it's in Matthew chapter 7. And here's what Jesus said. Listen carefully. Verse 13. He says, enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. What's Jesus saying? He's saying that every one of us are at the crossroads. And every one of us has two choices. One of them is the broad way, and one of them is the narrow and difficult way. And he says, you have to choose which one you're going to walk on. And he says, the problem with the broad way is it leads to destruction, but the narrow way, it's the one that leads to life. And he says, everybody chooses the broad way. How many of you have noticed that every city has a Broadway? Have you noticed that? Almost every city has a Broadway. Winnipeg has a Broadway. Is it a Broadway? It's a Broadway. It's a 4-lane street with a big boulevard down the middle with trees and fountains. And in the summer, you can buy hot dogs. Who wouldn't want to go to Broadway? I mean, Broadway is this fantastic street. But he says, don't go down the Broadway. That's where everybody's going, and that road leads to destruction. He says, the one that leads to life is the one through the narrow gate. And it's not only narrow, it's difficult. Narrow and difficult. Broad, narrow. See, here's our challenge. And see, people come, they stand at the crossroads. It's not that hard to figure out which one is the right road. You know which one is the right road? It's not the broad one. It's the narrow one. And here's the fascinating thing about ancient paths. Do you know when you travel the ancient world, there's no broad ways. There's no broad paths. There's no broad highways in the ancient world. See, we took a group, and in 2 weeks' time, we went to the Acropolis of ancient Greece. We went to the ancient city of Old Jerusalem in Israel. and we went to the pyramids of Giza in Egypt, all ancient. And here's the one thing I discovered about all those places that are thousands and thousands of years old. None of them have wide streets. Every one of them has narrow little paths. And we kept on finding ourselves in narrow little paths like this one. Little tiny thing. Really? Am I really supposed to go down this? There's something at the end of this? And you're going through this little channel. You think, this is not a street. There's no car that fits down here. Or you're going down these weird little stairs down into a hole somewhere. My son, when he was in Machu Picchu in Peru last year, speaking of narrow paths, they went to Machu Picchu, and this is called the Inca Bridge. I don't know about you, that looks like a difficult way. And it's narrow. You know, watch that first step. The first step's a doozy. And what is it with these ancient paths? The ancient paths are the narrow paths. But here's what people do, modern people. Do you know what they do? They like new stuff, not ancient stuff. See, the gospel is old. The gospel's 2,000 years old. And if we're going to choose the right path, it's going to be the old path. It's going to be the ancient path. There's not going to be something newer that's going to come along that's better than the old one. There's nothing new, but people love the new stuff, and that's why they're following after the New Age movement or Scientology or the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. That's a real thing, by the way. And there's a new religion that people are all hepped up about. You know what the new religion is? You probably haven't thought about this. It's technology. People think that technology is going to solve all their problems. They think technology is going to lead them into the path of peace. It won't. Do you see technology really solving our problems? For every problem that technology solves, it adds 10 more problems, right? I mean, it's like your cell phone. Your cell phone is a great device. I mean, we love our cell phones. A bunch of you are sitting on them right now in your pocket. You wish you were on that phone instead of listening to me. But you have to get through this sermon, and then you can check your texts. And I mean, the cell phone is a powerful tool. It's solved a lot of problems. But look at the problems it's caused. I mean, for goodness sakes, people can't drive down the road without texting and crashing into people and killing them. That's a problem. People have become addicted to this device. People are always on duty. Nobody's off work anymore. You notice that? I mean, your boss can get a hold of you 24/7 now, right? I thought, what's wrong with us? Here's the thing. Are you going to get peace from technology? No. Is it going to solve our problems? No. There's only one thing that's going to solve our problem. It's the old-time gospel. It's the ancient path, that path that Jesus laid down. And this is what Jesus said. He told us what the path was. He said, I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. You know what the narrow path is? Jesus. Jesus is the narrow path. He's the one we have to choose. Let me close with one final story here today. So in the 1800s, there was a famous preacher by the name of Charles Spurgeon. Might have been one of the most effective preachers of all time. He started pastoring Metropolitan Tabernacle. I've been there. It's in London. And he started pastoring that church when he was 19 years old. By the time he was 21 years old, he was the most famous preacher in the world, actually. And he preached to 5,000 people every single Sunday without a microphone or a PA system. And he was one of the most incredible and successful preachers. Thousands and thousands of people came to Christ in the years of 38 years that he pastored that church. And when he died in 1892, they had his funeral, and it was a public funeral, and it was a procession down the streets of London. And over 100,000 people showed up to his funeral. He was so beloved. They said there had never been a funeral like that in the streets of London except for that of the death of a monarch. And what kind of man would be so beloved that hundreds of thousands of people would show up to his funeral? That's how successful and that's how effective he was. And people always asked him this question. They said, Pastor Spurgeon, what is the secret to your success? And he says, I always tell them the same thing. I have no secret other than this. I preach the whole gospel. I don't preach about the gospel. I preach the gospel, the full, fresh, glorious gospel that has the power to change and transform lives. That's why I'm successful. There is only one thing that's really going to help us in this world, and it is choosing the ancient path, which is that old-time gospel, the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's why Paul said these words, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation to all that will believe. That is the narrow path, and that's the one we ought to choose.
Church of the Rock has services every Sunday at 1397 Buffalo Place, and we invite you to join us when you're in the Winnipeg area. If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. Visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.